Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
In 1957 Spain, a father and son stood at the dock weeping as their relatives departed by boat for Buenos Aires, driven away by an economic hardship that was quietly emptying the country of its own people. Running across Canada in 1980, Terry Fox covered 373 kilometers over 143 days before cancer forced him to stop. Yet his marathon of hope endured as a worldwide legacy for cancer research long after his death. Standing 36 inches tall and weighing 165 pounds, the Codex Gigas remains the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world, looted by Swedish forces from Prague in 1648, and infamous for its full-page portrait of the devil. Above Los Angeles in 1925, two daredevils set up a tennis court on the wing of a flying aircraft at 1,000 meters altitude, turning the open sky into a sporting arena of reckless and breathtaking audacity. Captured in the early 1930s, this newly released photograph shows blues musician Robert Johnson posed alongside fellow guitarist Johnny Shines, offering one of the rarest surviving glimpses of a man who became a towering legend of American music. Muhammad Ali and Bill Cosby, two of the most recognizable figures in American public life, were photographed together in 1970, sharing a casual, unguarded moment that placed two icons of their era simply cruising side by side. On the set of The Dark Knight, Heath Ledger was photographed alongside his manager, an image that carries quiet weight given what audiences and the world would lose before the film ever reached the screen. Released in 1981, the Sony Walkman 2 gave an entire generation the means to carry personal music wherever they went, a small machine that quietly reshaped how the world experienced sound. Stephen Hawking and his wife Jane were photographed together in 1965, an early portrait of a partnership formed just as one of the most extraordinary scientific minds of the 20th century was beginning to confront his diagnosis. Inside the Hershey factory in 1937, workers wrapped Kisses chocolates by hand on the production line, a moment that reveals the human labor quietly sustaining one of America's most recognizable consumer products at industrial scale. In 1899, Nikola Tesla sat inside his Colorado Springs laboratory surrounded by the electrical equipment he had built, a portrait of a man who had made himself the center of experiments that pushed at the boundaries of what science could control. Elvis Presley paused in 1959 to sign an autograph, a routine gesture by then, yet one that captures the personal transaction between a young star and a public that had already made him the defining face of a generation. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, ending a division that had split a city, a nation, and a continent for 28 years, and marking one of the most significant moments in the political history of the 20th century. In 1966, 5 megabytes of computer data required 62,500 punch cards stacked physically together, a load that took 4 full days to process and reveals just how vast the distance was to the computing world that followed. Trapped in Antarctic ice in 1915, Shackleton's ship Endurance became one of the most iconic images of polar exploration, a vessel caught and slowly crushed by forces that would eventually test every member of the expedition to their limit. Designed in Paris in 1932, the Abius bicycle was engineered to carry up to 120 pounds across both land and water, an invention that captured the experimental problem-solving spirit of interwar European engineering. Photographed in 1864 at the age of 100, William Hutchings was a living link to the American Revolution, born in 1764 and still alive to be documented by a camera technology that simply did not exist when he first took up arms. The lecture auditorium of Rush Medical College in Chicago, photographed in 1900, shows the formal architecture of early medical education, rows of students arranged in a space purpose-built for the serious business of training a new generation of doctors. A side-by-side comparison of Los Angeles in 1939 and 2021 places the same stretch of California cityscape across 8 decades of transformation, making visible in a single frame just how completely a modern metropolis can remake itself. In 1960, Otto Frank stood in the attic where he and his family had hidden during the Second World War, photographed by Arnold Newman in the very space where Anne Frank wrote the diary that would bear witness to them all. On October 24, 1962, President John F. Kennedy faced reporters in Washington during the Cuban Missile Crisis, addressing a standoff that brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear conflict than at any other moment in the Cold War. Workers at Hingley & Sons were photographed around 1909 forging the anchor chain for the Titanic, an image of industrial labor that sits with particular weight, given what the ship and everything attached to it would become just 3 years later. In 1940s New York City, women took to the streets on roller skates to promote wartime gas rationing, a colorized image that captures the creative civilian effort to make sacrifice feel both necessary and possible during the Second World War. A piano designed in 1935 in the United Kingdom for patients confined to bed placed music within reach of those whom illness had immobilized, a piece of design that took seriously the idea that bedridden lives still deserved access to culture. In New York City in 1919, a pyramid assembled from captured German helmets stood as a public monument to Allied victory, a striking display that turned the material debris of the First World War into a deliberate statement of triumph. In March 1966, North Dakota Department of Transportation worker Bill Cook was photographed standing beside a power pole in Jamestown almost entirely buried by snow, a single image that captures the scale of the North American blizzard that paralyzed the region. Photographed around 1890 in County Clare, Ireland, this colorized portrait of a mother and son carries the quiet dignity of ordinary life during a period when emigration and hardship had already defined the human landscape of rural Ireland for generations. In 1948, a woman was photographed wiring an early IBM computer, an image captured by Berenice Abbott that documents both the technical complexity, pioneering computing infrastructure, and the unsung role women played in building it. The Bumper 8 rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida, in 1950, marking the first launch from what would become the most consequential rocket facility in American history and a cornerstone of the space program that followed. Around 1910, a New York City subway car carried an experiment in gender-segregated travel, offering women a carriage of their own, with only one male conductor visible in the frame to suggest how the boundary between the two was maintained. In 1919, the British airship R-33 sat inside its Yorkshire hangar as engineers prepared it for its very first flight, a moment on the threshold of a short-lived era when lighter-than aircraft seemed to hold the future of long-distance travel. A milkman made a routine delivery to Streatham Grammar School in London in 1939, an image of ordinary civic life carrying its quiet, unstated weight given that Britain would be at war within months of the photograph being taken. A London fireman wearing a smoke helmet was photographed in 1908, his face almost entirely obscured by protective equipment that marked an early and determined effort to send men into burning buildings with something more than courage alone. Taken on May 7, 1858, this portrait of Abraham Lincoln by Abraham Byers captured the Illinois lawyer 3 years before he became president, preserving a face that history would come to know as one of the most consequential in American political life. Suspended at the summit of the World Trade Center in 1979, a worker repairs the tower's antenna in a photograph by Peter B. Kaplan, a single human figure at the very top of the New York skyline that makes the scale of the structure viscerally clear. Robert Wadlow, the tallest person in recorded human history, was photographed with his family in 1935, an image that places his extraordinary stature in the ordinary domestic setting of a family portrait, sharpening both the remarkable and the human in a single frame. A Chicago mailman was photographed in 1929 beneath the full weight of the Christmas postal surge, a colorized image that makes tangible both the seasonal scale of American consumer culture and the physical demands it placed on the workers who kept it moving. In 1939, the Grande Gallery of the Louvre stood entirely empty after its collection was evacuated ahead of the advancing German threat, a vast, echoing corridor stripped of everything it existed to hold, documenting Europe's urgent effort to save its own heritage from war. In January 1939 in Transylvania, Louisiana, a mother was photographed teaching her children letters and numbers at home. A portrait of sharecropper family life captured by Russell Lee that documents both the depth of rural poverty and the determination to educate within it. On February 7, 1984, NASA astronaut Bruce McCandless performed the first untethered spacewalk in history, drifting free above the Earth with nothing connecting him to the shuttle, a moment that remains one of the most striking images ever made in space. After winning the 1999 NBA championship, the San Antonio Spurs were photographed gathered around computers playing StarCraft, an image that places the reigning champions of professional basketball inside the parallel world of competitive gaming at the very peak of its cultural rise. Japanese Type D Koryu midget submarine sat in dry dock in 1945, vessels designed for close-range naval warfare that never altered the outcome of a war already turning decisively against the empire that had built them. A war veteran was photographed selling matches on a street corner in Canterbury, England in 1928, a quiet and devastating image of a man reduced to the margins of the economy by a conflict that had taken his service and given him very little in return. Built atop the Fiat Lingato factory in Turin in 1923, a fully operational automobile test track ran circuits above the production floor below, making the rooftop of an industrial building one of the most unusual racing venues in the history of motoring. The ruins of Dresden in 1945, photographed from the tower of the Rathaus looking south, document the near-total destruction of a city after Allied bombing, an image that has anchored debates about the conduct and costs of strategic warfare ever since. Armored vehicles sat row upon row in a United States storage facility in 1946, parked and idle in the aftermath of the Second World War, a landscape of surplus military power that made visible just how vast the machinery of that conflict had been. In a Cuban cigar factory around 1900, a hired reader stood before workers rolling cigars by hand, reading aloud to fill the hours of repetitive labor, a practice that turned the factory floor into a space of collective listening and informal education. French forces deployed flamethrowers against enemy positions in 1916, a weapon that turned the already brutal landscape of the First World War into something even more immediate and consuming, its use a measure of how far industrial warfare had advanced in its capacity for destruction. Exhibited at the Bata Shoe Museum in Ontario, these German Gothic sabatons from the 1490s survive as precisely crafted armor for the feet, artifacts that reveal the sophisticated metalworking that late medieval warfare demanded even for the most overlooked parts of the body. In 1963 in Berlin, a man crossed from East to West Germany by driving through Checkpoint Charlie with his windshield removed, a calculated act of desperation that turned his own vehicle into the instrument of an escape the Cold War's most guarded border was designed to prevent. In September 1953, teenage girls pull taffy at a party while their friends look on, a candid slice of post-war American leisure captured in color by photographer Charlotte Brooks. Standing in the White House greenhouse in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. poses among the lush plants of a private world rarely seen by the American public. The night of their 1940 elopement in Greenwich, Connecticut, Desi Arnaz carries his new bride Lucille Ball into his Roxy Theater dressing room, wedding and performance obligations colliding in a single moment. Two American sailors stretch out and finally rest after years of wartime service, their posture alone speaking to the exhaustion and relief that followed the end of World War II. In Times Square on May 8, 1945, crowds flood the streets in open celebration as news breaks that the war in Europe has ended, the weight of years of conflict lifting in a single night. At the 1985 Chicago Blues Festival, a man balances his baby in one arm and a beer in the other, a candid moment where everyday fatherhood and music culture meet on common ground. In late 19th century India, a British officer reclines at ease while a servant fans him with a palm frond and another tends to his feet, a composed image of colonial hierarchy made visible. Two women step out openly in the 1970s as participants in the No Bray movement, their presence on the street a direct physical expression of the feminist cultural shifts reshaping that decade. In 1990, Soviet water polo legend Petr Meshvenirad sits with his young grandson, a quiet generational portrait made in the final years of the user. A United States soldier plays with local children on a cart in West Germany during the 1980s, a human moment set against the long backdrop of the American post-war presence in Europe. Kurt Russell stands on the set of Stargate in 1994, photographed during production of the science fiction film that would become a foundation for one of television's longest-running franchises. In 1959, Sir David Attenborough crouches beside his young daughter as she meets a noisy cockatoo, a private family moment caught early in the career of the man who would become broadcasting's foremost voice on the natural world. An Australian woman stands with two Borzoi dogs in the bushland near Bendigo, Victoria in the 1930s, the elegant hounds and open landscape forming a portrait of rural life on another continent. In the 1920s and 1930s, New York City apartment dwellers secured wire cages outside their windows so infants could sleep in fresh air, a practice that reflected the era's medical thinking about childhood health. Children dressed in new clothes stand ready for the school year in 1970, a simple domestic moment that doubles as a quiet document of the fashions and textures of its time. Photographed around 1990, a display of ripe tomatoes sits in frame with a kind of unceremonious directness that gives vernacular photography its distinct and lasting appeal. In 1983, Secret Service agents moved swiftly to evacuate President Reagan from Augusta National Golf Club after Charles Harris took 7 hostages and demanded to speak directly with the president. On a sweltering summer night in 1948, New York City residents sleep out on fire escapes to find relief from the heat, their rooftop beds a practical solution and a portrait of urban resilience. Photographer Leonard McComb captured a man of the Navajo Nation, Arizona in 1948 as his wife carefully brushes his hair, a moment of quiet intimacy documented with rare access and restraint. Around 1973, a father guides his son through his first attempts at riding a bicycle in Central Park, New York City, an ordinary rite of passage recorded against the backdrop of the park's enduring daily life. During her 1954 tour of Korea, Marilyn Monroe visits American troops, and one soldier's Polaroid preserves what a fellow serviceman described as the most beautiful and refreshing sight most of those men had seen in months. In 1943, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt exchanges a hongi with tribal leader Rangitiera Denon at Wakarewarewa, New Zealand, during her visit to U.S. forces, a gesture of respect that crossed cultural boundaries in the middle of a world war. Photographed in 1939, a young girl sits in the corner of a kitchen inside a family's tent home, her surroundings a direct record of the displacement and poverty that defined Depression-era America. In 1956, IBM ships a 5-megabyte hard drive, a piece of equipment whose sheer physical scale marks just how far computing storage technology would travel in the decades that followed. In 1906, Congolese Mbudiman Otabenga was exhibited in a cage at the Bronx Zoo alongside an orangutan, his sharpened teeth exploited by promoters to market him as a cannibal in one of American history's most condemned acts of racial dehumanization. In 1965, girls race sheep through the streets of Aberystwyth, Wales, a local tradition that produced one of the more exuberant and unexpected images from that decade's archive of British rural life. One day before his execution in 2003, Paul Jennings Hill holds a press conference at Florida State Prison, years after his conviction for the murders of abortion provider John Britton and his bodyguard James Herman Barrett Jr. In 1994, Aishwarya Rai shares a traditional meal with her mother shortly after being crowned Miss World, a portrait of quiet grace in the immediate aftermath of one of the most watched competitions in the world. The 1992 United States men's Olympic basketball team, assembled for the Games in Barcelona, brought together the greatest concentration of professional talent ever to represent the country on an international court. In Edinburgh, Texas in 1939, a young migrant boy is photographed amid the same wave of displacement and economic hardship that sent thousands of families moving across the American landscape during the Depression years. Working in Paris in 1928, Jacques Biederer applies his craft behind the camera, building a body of erotic photography that would establish him as one of the most significant, if long obscured, figures in that genre's early history. In 1957, legendary custom car builder Dean Jeffries works on the front of his 1947 Mercury alongside his high school sweetheart Carol Lewis, the moment captured by fellow automotive icon George Barris. Rick Steves sets off the day after his 1973 high school graduation carrying a massive pack and a 10-week Eurail pass on a budget of $3 a day, a journey he later credited as the origin of his lifelong dedication to European travel. On March 31, 2003, an Iraqi prisoner of war holds his 4-year-old son close, the child's presence in a wartime detention setting, making the photograph one of the most affecting images from the early weeks of the conflict. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, and photographs of Ukrainian soldiers in those first days document the opening hours of what would become the largest and deadliest war on European soil since World War II. In 1999, Kimberly J. Brown, Frankie Muniz, Michelle Trachtenberg, and Amanda Bynes are photographed together, 4 young actors who each defined a distinct corner of the late 90s teen entertainment landscape. A couple sits together in 1973 with what the caption calls a funky breakfast, a small domestic tableau that carries the unmistakable visual signature of the early 70s. In 1963, photographer Richard Avedon documented 106-year-old William Casby alongside his great-great-granddaughter, a man born into slavery in Danville, Virginia in 1857 whose lifespan stretched from bondage to the civil rights era. 20 minutes after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in 1945, a photograph records the sky above the city still thick with smoke, an image taken while the event itself was still unfolding. A photograph from the 1960s captures an Easter gathering, its clothing and setting serving as a quiet visual record of how the holiday was marked in the middle decades of the 20th century. Photographed in 1964, the ossuary at Douaumont, France, holds the unidentified remains of more than 130,000 soldiers killed at Verdun, their bones commingled regardless of which side they fought on in one of history's most devastating battles. 2 Somali women are photographed at a bar in Mogadishu in 1968, dressed in modern fashion in an image that documents the city's social life before the political upheavals that would transform it in the decades ahead. In 1989, an ACT UP protester holds a sign depicting Donald Trump as Freddy Krueger, a street-level image from the height of the AIDS activist movement's confrontational campaign for public attention and government action. In 1941, a young boy eats a piece of bread on the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, a single image carrying the full weight of the systematic starvation and confinement imposed on the Jewish population under Nazi occupation. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was a common and widely accepted practice in the 1960s, and photographs from the era show children and adults alike traveling openly in truck beds as an unremarkable fact of daily life. At Woodstock in 1969, a hippie couple is photographed together, their image becoming part of the vast visual record of the festival that came to define a generation's aspirations around music, community, and cultural rebellion. A photograph from 1945 captures a moment of ease and ordinary life, taken in a year when the ending of a global war made the simplest images of calm carry an outsized and particular meaning. During the Falklands War in 1982, a penguin stands upright alongside a British soldier, a photograph whose unlikely pairing of combatant and native wildlife became one of the more quietly striking images from that conflict. In Germany in the 1930s, Roland, a 4,000-pound elephant seal, receives a snow bath from his handler at the Berlin Zoo, a scene that drew visitors to witness one of the largest animals then held in European captivity. The Beastie Boys are photographed on the streets of New York in 1987. Captured at the moment the trio was transitioning from punk provocateurs into one of the defining acts of hip-hop's first decade of mainstream impact. In 1973, children walk through Greenland alongside their grandmother, the photograph offering a glimpse of daily life and generational continuity in one of the world's most remote inhabited landscapes. McDonald's workers are photographed during the 1976 Christmas season. Their uniforms and surroundings a precise time capsule of how the fast food industry looked and operated at the midpoint of its most explosive period of growth. With smoke still rising from the World Trade Center site, President George W. Bush travels by air from New York to Washington in 2001, a photograph taken in the immediate aftermath of the attacks that reshaped American foreign and domestic policy. In March 1943, an Indian section gang is photographed at work near Cajon, California. Their labor on the railroad infrastructure, a part of the wartime effort that seldom received the public recognition it warranted. In 1925, Norwegian musher Gunnar Kaasen and his lead dog Balto completed the final leg of the serum run to Nome, Alaska, delivering diphtheria antitoxin across brutal winter terrain and saving the city from a deadly epidemic. In November 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges walks toward an all-white New Orleans school as segregationists taunt her with a black doll placed in a coffin, one woman among them issuing repeated threats to poison the child. In 1963, Jacques Cousteau and his crew descend in a submersible during the Conshelf 2 expedition in the Red Sea, pushing the boundaries of underwater habitation research and producing footage that would reach millions of viewers worldwide. Women in the early 1900s appear in swimsuits that were considered daring for their era, their beachwear marking a small but visible shift in the social boundaries around women's dress and public presence. Photographed between 1915 and 1925, a King Island Inuit woman and child posed together in Alaska, an image taken during a period when outside documentation of indigenous Arctic communities was still rare and often mediated by outside observers. Monica Bellucci and Sofia Vergara are photographed together in 1988, an early image of two women who would each, on separate paths, become among the most internationally recognized actors of their generation. School pizza from the 1970s occupies a particular place in the collective memory of American students from that era, and photographs of cafeteria lunches from the decade confirm the distinctive look of those institutional meals. In 1976, Arnold Schwarzenegger attends a ballet class led by teacher Marianne Claire, deliberately studying movement and form to bring greater grace to his bodybuilding poses in the tradition of the ancient Greek athletic ideal, admired. Rose Byrne and Heath Ledger are photographed together in 1999, two young Australian actors at the very beginning of the careers that would take them to opposite ends of Hollywood's landscape in the years that followed. A refrigerator from the 1920s documented the early domestication of cold storage technology, capturing the moment when mechanical refrigeration first began replacing the ice delivery trades of the previous generation. On the set in 1966, Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef posed together as the good, the ugly, and the bad, the three faces of Sergio Leone's defining spaghetti western. On the surface of the moon sits a memorial to every astronaut and cosmonaut who died in the pursuit of space exploration, a tribute that crosses the Cold War divide between American and Soviet programs. On the day both his wife and mother died within hours of each other, Theodore Roosevelt recorded the loss in a single diary entry, a document of private grief from a man the world knew only as a force of will. A photochrome image taken between 1890 and 1900 captured young women on Marken Island in Holland, preserving the dress and daily life of a coastal Dutch community at the close of the 19th century. The carving of Mount Rushmore transformed a granite cliff face in the Black Hills into one of the most recognizable monuments in American history, a project that reshaped a landscape on a monumental scale. In 1965, customers browsed color televisions in a store, a scene that captured the moment when color broadcasting shifted from novelty to an expected feature of the modern American living room. The 1899 World's Fair in Paris, the Exposition Universelle, was captured in rare photographs that document the extraordinary scale of a global exhibition designed to display the achievements of the 19th century. The station wagon became one of the defining vehicles of mid-century American family life, its elongated silhouette a fixture of suburbs, school runs, and cross-country drives across decades of domestic history. In 1951, the Admiral Telebar combined a television set with a home bar into a single unit, a product that captured the post-war American appetite for leisure, entertainment, and modern domestic convenience. In France in 1961, Louis Armstrong signed the head of a fan with a doodle, a moment that distilled the extraordinary warmth and accessibility that made him one of the most beloved figures in jazz. At Wembley Stadium in 1986, Freddie Mercury performed on stage at the height of his powers, delivering what many who were present would later describe as the greatest live performance of the rock era. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush gazed at the Capitol from a helicopter after departing the inauguration of his successor, a quiet image that framed the peaceful transfer of presidential power. In the 1870s, retailers devised a peculiar advertising technique in which women were hired to pose with products and signs, their photographs distributed as postcards in one of the earliest known forms of commercial image advertising.